Well, thank you for coming back so promptly. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. Our next speaker is very much a fixture of the Glastonbury Symposium and has become a very important one over the years. Now, Ian Crane, or Ian R. Crane, I should say, to be precise, is somebody who for many years has been challenging convention and indeed being a conspiracy theorist in the truest sense of the word, and has done very, very good work. I mean, Ian's lectures have been broadcast on Edge Media TV, Sky 200, if you haven't discovered it yet. And indeed, Ian lectures around the world trying to show people what is going on now. And Ian's talks are always about the now. And really, in a way, when earlier on I was talking about the Codex Alimentarius, I should equally have shown a picture of Ian, because Ian has done fantastic work in alerting people to what's going on with the restriction of high-dose vitamins, natural health supplements, this kind of thing. And I should also tell you that at the Alternative View conference back in May or April, whenever it was, at Heathrow, Scott Tipps was speaking there and suddenly surprised Ian. Not many things surprise Ian, but this did surprise Ian. And Ian was indeed given an award, and I'm going to read this so I get this absolutely right. It was from the National Health Federation, and the award was for the Health Freedom Hero Award. And I think he deserves a massive round of applause for that alone. And if I tell you that the winner of the award the year before was Ron Paul, for those who will know what that means, that shows you what good company Ian is in. So we're going to have, I suspect, a hard-hitting but absolutely vital presentation now from Ian. So big round of applause again for Mr. Ian R. Crane.
When the drum beats go like this.
The only way that a human being can get a bird flu or a swine flu is if it is injected in them.
So how did we get swine flu then?
It's been made in a factory and injected.
Say no to the vaccine. Needle on the record, put the needle on the record, put the needle on the record when the drum beats. I put the needle to the record cause the needle is defective, and the needle breaks the record when the needle is the method for prevention of the fever, bringing death to the receiver. There's no effort in believing that the method feeds the fever. See the leader, diseases are invented in the lab. One believes it on reading recent mentions of the jab, centered in a grand scab of corruption and lies, injecting views of doom from newsroom into the public eye. But now the floor has risen on a cause of autism. Doctors show research and scores applaud with them. It's mercury and vaccines, often there's more given. Peace ignored and forbidden, cause profit is war driven. A score billion on vaccines alone, and the government don't care, they're always taxing the clones. And the CDC is right behind this rolling cart, part involved from the start in this evolving art. A big pharma, big deception, Obama, big karma. Enter White, Roach, Bayer and Baxter Healthcare. All the sordid history with stacks of health scares. You got HIV and bird flu mixed up in the shots. I've been connecting the dots between the money that swaps. Conspiracy, yeah, I sense a couple of plots.
If you never want to get the swine flu, don't go get the swine flu vaccine.
There is one little word that could save your health. Just say no. Say no to the vaccine. And if the doctor says, then make him take it himself. Just say no. Say no to the vaccine. There is one little word that could save your health. Just say no. Say no to the vaccine. And if Obama says, then make him take it himself. Just say no. Say no to the vaccine.
I don't need your prescription, I ain't got no affliction. Corporate pharmaceutical teaming with politicians. Put them on prescription, that should be our own decision. Whether we want spending on vaccines or health and education. Soon they enlist the general populace. They adding to the list pharmaceutical benefits. Yo, Alexa, Finline, GlaxoSmithKline, profit margin fine. Still ain't seen your disease, maca, cough and dead or swine. Depopulation linked with holding vaccines. Rather let a product lapse and save some human beings. Now that there's a kind of the beans, so they won't hear us when we running on the machine. Yo, another flu, yo, that ain't our biggest threat. What about an aging population with no safety net? So we continue to believe everything we read. There just ain't no taste in that news feed.
Weapons of trial and error. We're smiling in terror at the doctor and nurse. Take a hold of yourself and control of your health and say no.
No, why don't you go first?
But there's one little word that can save your health. Just say no. Say no to the vaccine. If the doctor says, then make him take it himself. Say no, 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 say no to the vaccine. There's one little word that could save your health. Just say no. Say no to the vaccine. And if Obama says, then make him take it himself. Just say no. Say no to the vaccine.
Don't get any injection. You never know what's in them. They're all poison.
1976, it was thought we were on the brink of another major flu outbreak. Medical science appeared to be prepared. The experts planned to use their best weapon yet, prevention with the flu vaccine. 500 soldiers in Fort Dix, New Jersey, came down with the flu in February of 1976. Private David Lewis died, and it was determined that he had suffered from swine flu. At the time, it was feared that approximately 500 other soldiers on the base were ill with the same strain of influenza, and the alarm was sounded. In March 76, President Gerald Ford announced the biggest immunization program in history.
This virus was the cause of a pandemic in 1918 and 1919 that resulted in over 500,000 deaths in the United States.
Ford's intention was to vaccinate every man, woman, and child in the United States. Vaccine was rushed into production and imported in great quantities. The cost was to be about $135 million. And the first batch of vaccine was delivered on November 1st. The first public swine flu clinic opened 3 weeks later. From the beginning, the program was criticized for being hastily implemented and unnecessary. But over 50 million people in North America were inoculated at a cost of $100 million before investigators discovered an apparent increase in a rare paralytic disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome among the recently vaccinated. This and the fact that the epidemic failed to materialize led to a quick end to the vaccination program in December 1976.
Researchers and experts now fear that the failure of the swine flu epidemic to materialize in 76 will have detrimental effects on preparations for future pandemics. Dr. Arthur Silverstein was an advisor to the U.S. Senate Health Committee in 1976 and has written a book about the swine flu scare. Dr. Silverstein, you called your book about the experiences of 76 pure politics, impure science. Why is that the right image for those experiences?
I think it's the right image because whereas one still didn't then and still doesn't know all that much about the science of influenza virus, one knows a fair amount about how politics works in Washington. And politics worked very smoothly, although the science did not in the 76 flu outbreak.
My name is Ian Crane, and I am a conspiracy theorist. Now, let me say, I'm going to spend the first part of this presentation talking about swine flu, but I'm going to offer the caveat that I'm not a medical practitioner. So I would absolutely encourage not a single one of you to take anything that I say at face value. There is no need to. Because during the course of the presentation, I'm going to explain the references so you can go check this stuff out for yourself. And in my opinion, over the coming weeks, there has never been a time when it's been more important to educate yourself. Now, that little video was put together by a guy called Jody Lloyd in New Zealand. He lives in Christchurch, New Zealand. And he's a young guy. He performs under the name of Trillion. And I think he has demonstrated that all around the world, people are starting to make the effort to educate themselves. And so they should. Because we don't have to look too hard to see the first piece of a jigsaw that should give us some serious cause for concern. Because do you know who the architect was behind the 1976 swine flu outbreak? The architect was none other than Donald Rumsfeld. Isn't it amazing how often this guy crops up? And of course, his buddy, Cheney, is never far behind. And these guys have a political career that goes back sort of some 40-odd years. So these guys are extremely practiced in the art of manipulation. And Donald Rumsfeld dreamed up the swine flu scam in 1976 to provide a sort of wag the dog type scenario for President Gerald Ford, who was struggling in the primaries against his opponent, who was a guy who went by the name of George Herbert Walker Bush. So the idea was that it does appear that one person died of swine flu at Fort Dix. One person. And they used that as the basis with which to announce a swine flu epidemic, pandemic. Ford signed off $135 million for the vaccine and started a program of mass inoculation. Unfortunately, or fortunately I should say, very quickly, it was identified that there were some pretty serious effects from the vaccination, up to and including death, which is the caveat that these drug makers offer on all of their commercials in the US. So, and as you heard on the video there, the other spin-off was a massive spread of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which was also known as infantile paralysis, and this affects the nervous system. So it was obviously not good PR, so it was very quickly buried. And, of course, actually, Ford didn't get re-elected. He was replaced by Jimmy Carter, who was a protege of Zbigniew Brzezinski. And, of course, we have a protege of Zbigniew Brzezinski in the White House right now. So you see how the same players, keep cropping up. But let's just take a look here at some of the other things very quickly that Rumsfeld's hand can be spotted in. Oh, that's a better picture of Rumsfeld. I think. Here we go. So he's Mr. Aspartame as well, of course, because he was the CEO of Searle when aspartame was developed. Couldn't get it into the food chain. So he put a phenomenal amount of money behind Reagan's presidential campaign. And the moment Reagan was sworn in on the White House lawn, Rumsfeld reminded him that he owed him one and got him to change the head of the Food and Drug Administration, the guy who had prevented aspartame from going into the food chain. By May of that year, aspartame was in the food chain. Later, Rumsfeld was instrumental in selling Searle to Monsanto. He personally made $15 million on the deal. He was the chief executive of a company called Gilead Sciences from 1995 until 2001, when he was invited to become Secretary of State for Defense by George W. Bush. Whilst he was head of Gilead Sciences, the company developed a drug that we know today as Tamiflu. They had no idea what to do with it, so they actually sold the marketing rights to a company called Roche, a Swiss pharmaceutical company. And it shouldn't be any great surprise that nobody had really heard of Tamiflu until Rumsfeld is Secretary of State for Defense. And it's not too many years later that we hear the first mention of bird flu. And lo and behold, the magic formula to counter the coming pandemic for bird flu is Tamiflu. Amazing. And of course, he was also one of the major architects whilst he was CEO of Gilead. He was a member of the right-wing think tank group, the Project for New American Century. He was one of the signatories on a letter sent to Clinton in 1998 requesting that Clinton actually invade Iraq. Clinton obviously chose to ignore the letter. So they wrote a much longer strategy document, which is called Rebuilding America's Defenses, which was published in September of 2000, exactly 1 year before 9/11. And of course, on 9/11, Rumsfeld, well, we still don't know exactly where he was, but apparently he was purportedly in the other side of the Pentagon, about as far away as you could get from the wall that was actually hit by whatever. But of course, the day before, on September the 10th, one of his direct subordinates, a guy called Rabbi Dov Zakheim, appeared before the media to announce that the Pentagon could not account for $2.3 trillion. And, of course, that was all lost in the events of the following day. I mean, how could he have known? How could he have known that September the 10th was an amazing day to bury bad news? Then, of course, as Secretary of State for Defense, he'd already drafted the rules of engagement for Afghanistan. He was the architect behind the weapons of mass destruction. And, of course, he's going to make out, or has already made out, like a bandit, thanks to all the doses of Tamiflu being used up, which, by the way, in many cases were about to reach their expiry date. Oh, what a coincidence. So they managed to shift all that old shelf life stuff, and now all the governments around the world are having to order new stock. So, it really is a case of watch this space here. Now, there's a couple of things that I just wanted to share with you, and like I said, I do want to encourage you to do your own research. But there's something missing from the Tamiflu that is distributed in Europe, and that's a warning that the Food and Drug Administration have insisted appears on the boxes of Tamiflu in the US since November of 2006. And this was because the Food and Drug Administration had 12 reports from Japan of pediatric deaths in patients taking Tamiflu. The FDA concluded that it was unable to determine if the deaths were caused by Tamiflu and decided to monitor Tamiflu side effects in the 2006 flu season. During the following year, the Food and Drug Administration continued to receive reports of neuropsychiatric events in patients taking Tamiflu. Many of the additional reports came from Japan, but some came from the US as well. On November the 13th, 2006, the FDA decided to require a Tamiflu warning similar to that already used in Japan. And that warning reads that patients taking Tamiflu should be carefully monitored for unusual behavior. It's a psychoactive. It has led to teen suicides, to self-harming. That is not mentioned on the boxes of the Tamiflu distributed in Europe. It is my opinion that this is part of an agenda to reduce the population. Last year in my presentation, The War on Terror, that's TRRA, the War on Earth, I talked about the Georgia Guidestones, and I showed that the New World Order agenda is actually spelled out in tablets of stone. So go Google Georgia Guidestones. So a little bit of background on some of the stuff that we've uncovered. I'm just going to give you a few pointers because I'm not going to give you the whole deal because I want to leave enough for you to go find out for yourself. But as recently as 2005, a small team from the Center for Disease Control, they were using tissue material from the frozen bodies of Alaskan victims from the 1918 outbreak of Spanish flu, which, by the way, is just a construct name. It has no relationship with Spanish at all. In fact, the Spanish were really pissed back in 1918 that they decided to call it Spanish flu. Anyway, to determine genetics, the genetic sequence, and replicate the virus, which they were certainly successful in doing. And this is the start of the problem. Now, anybody who suggests that the government, our government, wasn't warned that there was going to be a pandemic doesn't need to look too far, because I've actually managed to obtain a copy of this PowerPoint presentation called Exercise Winter Willow from 2006. And in 2006, this is a presentation that was made to every single health authority in the country about how to deal when or if a flu pandemic breaks out. Now, once again, we're following the same pattern here, like, exercises occurring on the same day as the events of 9/11. Peter Power conducting his exercise at exactly the same 3 stations where the bombs went off on July the 7th. Same thing happened in Madrid. And here we've got an exercise going on so that every health authority knows exactly what they're expected to do, and it goes right into detail about how to deal with the dead. And that comes from 2006. So these guys had a heads up. Last year, an informal flu vaccine test carried out on 200 homeless Poles. It was a vaccine manufactured by Novartis. 5 died immediately, apparently with a needle still in their arm. That's how potent this thing was. And 20 others died shortly after. And the medical staff involved were charged with murder. Anybody see that in the media? No, funny that, isn't it? Then Baxter. Now, Baxter, this is the company to watch. Because the outbreak of swine flu in Mexico occurred just a few miles from Baxter's facility in Mexico. So, I mean, this is all coincidence, of course, but, you add it all together and you start to build quite a coherent picture. So, Baxter International's Austrian laboratory released a contaminated seasonal flu vaccine to 18 European countries. This was in last autumn. But a Czech lab technician fortunately discovered the contamination, and the contamination was a highly pathogenic strain of bird flu. I mean, had that Czech technician not spotted this, then those vaccines would have been administered right throughout Europe to all those people who regularly take their annual flu vaccine, and we would have had genocide. Absolute genocide. But guess what? The World Health Organization investigation found there was no case of negligence. But a number of specialists, virologists and immunologists have said that this is unlikely to have been accidental because there are so many checks in place before vaccines are released. 18 batches. It's just not possible to assume that 18 batches could have been distributed with the same contamination. One of them would have been picked up. So now we come up to date, and Baxter is actually tasked with developing the vaccine for the predicted global swine flu pandemic. Now, Baxter was given the seed virus by the World Health Organization in May. And now they're saying they're going to have a vaccine ready by the end of July. And the British government have announced that they will release that vaccine after just 5 days of tests. I mean, this is completely outrageous. I mean, the swine flu vaccine that was being used in 1976, they actually changed the rules because they were actually trying to conceal how many people were dying because of the vaccination. So they changed the rules, and they said that basically anybody who dies after 48 hours after having the inoculation, it wouldn't be classified, it wouldn't be registered as a death related to the vaccination. It would be some other underlying cause. So you can see why there is tremendous concern that the vaccine, untried, untested, may actually be the problem, not the swine flu. And the Bush administration last year announced that all vaccine producers would be exempted from all liability. So, we have the Guillain-Barré. I mean, there are still people alive, who suffer the effects of that. We have the Guillain-Barré syndrome. But it doesn't matter what this vaccine causes, and we don't know what it would cause because it's untried, it's untested. We know that Novartis, which isn't Baxter, admittedly, but when Novartis made their trial in Poland, the homeless people didn't fare very well. And basically, I mean, this is, a very serious concern. And I'm going to share with you something in a moment that is definitely not been reported in the British media, that many virologists and scientists believe that the virus could not have evolved naturally, that it is a laboratory construct. Now, some of you, or all of you, may remember this situation from last year. It's been in the media recently because the court case came to a conclusion of the alleged perpetrators of these brutal murders. I mean, these two French students were tortured for hours, allegedly, to get their PIN numbers from their credit cards. I mean, for God's sake, how much money does a student have in their account? And the torture was just, completely outrageous. I mean, it was obviously conducted by, some absolute psychopaths. But back last September, I actually picked this up because I saw this in the American Free Press, and I thought, I'm just going to hang on to this because this just might be interesting a little bit down the road. Sure enough, these two young French biochemists were working on a project to identify the origins of the bird flu virus. A week before they were brutally murdered, Gabriel Ferez had his laptop stolen. On that laptop was all of his research. Now, the court case has been going on over the last few months, and the two alleged perpetrators have indeed been sentenced. Now, the media, I actually saw a media article writing about these guys, and it was actually making the statement that the sentence as it was laid out by the judge meant that these guys could be released inside 4 years. Now, do you know what that tells me? They didn't do it. They definitely didn't do it. The torture and abuse that these two students were subjected to should mean that the perpetrators are locked up in Rampton for life, not potentially going to be released after 4 years. So my conjecture, because none of this relationship with their studies was mentioned during the hearing, my conjecture is that there's a distinct possibility that these guys were told to take the rap. There was probably something else on them, but they were told to take the rap, shut the hell up, take your punishment, and you'll be out in 4 years. And if you don't, then the crimes that we have got you for, you'll do 15. Hypothetical for sure. I'm joining the dots here, but probably not too far wrong. Here was the statement in the media. I mean, the program of fear is being accelerated. I think in today's papers, there's a double-page spread in all of the papers saying what to do when the swine flu pandemic breaks out. But none of them say, don't take the vaccination. It's all building up to getting people to voluntarily go along and be vaccinated. And as Simon Jenkins said just, I think yesterday, this is the politics of fear at its absolute extreme. It is an established tactic for control. This, of course, being put into the media, who's going to get the priority? Oh my God, I'm not top of the list. Thank God. And this is the serious concern. I mean, most of you who've seen my other presentations or DVDs are aware of my personal views on vaccinations on children anyway. We are pumping poisons into the young bodies 26 times, I think it is now, before they reach school age. In some states in the US, it is mandatory that they go through these vaccination programs or they cannot get into the state school system. And in some states, certainly California is one of them, homeschooling is now illegal unless you are a qualified teacher. And if you don't vaccinate your children, then your children can be forcibly removed from the family, vaccinated, and if deemed appropriate, actually taken into care. And of course, the great concern is that this is perhaps very close now in Europe. In fact, in Texas, Governor Rick Perry, late last year, decreed that the HPV vaccine for 13-year-old schoolgirls would be mandatory. And we know, Dr. Leonard Horowitz gave a presentation at the Alternative View 2 just a couple of months ago, and he mentioned that there are a number of cases known to him where the recipients of the vaccine have died. He says there are 20 cases of young girls that have died around the US, and those are just the ones he can uncover. Earlier today, we heard about the 45 minutes to doom. Of course, this was the fear factor for getting everybody to sign up to the Iraq War. And Norman Baker mentioned the article from The Sun. There it is. 45 minutes from doom. Unbelievable. Well, let me just share something with you here, because the punchline of this may come as quite a surprise. This is actually from a book. It's actually from the intro page to a book called The Palestine Plot. And it's titled The Real Objectives of the Present War. And it says, the real objective of the present war is the establishment of the international police state on the Russian model, beginning with Great Britain. This contemplates the complete abolition of human rights. The elimination of Great Britain in the cultural sense, the EU, which we're going to touch on a bit later, and the establishment of the Jewish American ideals. The only difference is that that present war was actually the Second World War. And this book was published in 1939. And these observations were made by a guy called C.H. Douglas, writing on September the 23rd, 1939. So 20 days after, or sorry, less than 20 days, isn't it? 20 days after the start of the Second World War. And yet we see those same objectives in play today, but perhaps they're a little bit more evident. So I recommend you this book, by the way, if you can get hold of a copy, The Palestine Plot. So the 45 Minutes from Doom, the dodgy dossier. And as Norman mentioned this morning, of course, that dodgy dossier probably pulled together by Alistair Campbell. Actually, I don't think it was Alistair Campbell. I actually give Alistair Campbell a little bit more credence. It was probably pulled together by an intern who Campbell had tasked with putting together a document. The intern hit the web, found this document that was written by an Iraqi postgraduate student back in the early 1990s, and then cobbled it together. And of course, it became the basis of British foreign policy, which is just, completely outrageous. And of course, Jack Straw was saying, well, I can live with it. So what we've got coming up, we think, is a inquiry, which of course initially it was announced was going to be in secret, but under some pressure from the media, it actually does look as though some of it might actually now be in public. But I mean, it's been ascertained that there's absolutely no question that Tony Blair was putting extreme pressure on Gordon Brown to hold the inquiry in private, in camera. Well, you know what? A friend of mine sent me a copy of the minutes for the missing cabinet meeting. And this is the cabinet meeting that was held on the 3rd of March 2003. And the minutes have never been published. Well, let me read you what he says. Apologies for absence, Mr. Robin Cook. The minutes of the previous meetings were read by Mr. A. Campbell and approved. Any other business? The Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Tony Blair, announced that the President of the United States had decided to invade Iraq as soon as possible, and had also decided that Britain would join him in the invasion. The Prime Minister said that he was 100% behind the President on this matter and asked Mr. Campbell to hand round copies of a dossier he had prepared in conjunction with the Joint Services Intelligence Committee, proving why the need for the invasion was, in Mr. Campbell's words, a fucking no-brainer. The Attorney General, Mr. Goldsmith, said that since the previous meeting he had expressed some reservations about the legality of invading a country for no reason at all. He had consulted a higher authority, Mr. Blair, and was now of a mind to support the Prime Minister in whatever it was that he and Mr. Bush wished quite legally to do so. The Foreign Secretary, Mr. Straw, said that he was sure he spoke for all his colleagues in congratulating the Prime Minister on his proposed course of action, and thanked him for letting the Cabinet know about the decision before it was published in the daily papers. The Prime Minister thanked Mr. Straw for his loyal support and asked the Chancellor, Mr. Brown, whether his grumpy silence during the meeting could be taken as wholehearted support. Mr. Brown made a noise which was interpreted as a yes. Mr. Brown then asked the Cabinet to demonstrate their backing for his proposed invasion with a show of hands. Mr. Campbell then explained to various ministers, including the Secretary of State for International Affairs, Mrs. Claire Short, that he knew where they lived. After which the motion was passed unanimously. The Prime Minister closed the meeting by leading the Cabinet in a short chorus of his own composition, the words of which were as follows: "Forward, forward, never back. God has told me to invade Iraq." There being no further business, it was decided to inform Mr. Bush that the invasion could proceed as planned, and the meeting was closed. Yeah, funnily enough. Thanks to Private Eye. But, Tony Blair, funnily enough, those minutes, those spoof minutes, are probably not far from a paraphrase of the reality. Robin Cook went as far as he possibly dare, I think, and it still cost him his life one way or another, if only because of the psychological pressure it brought to bear. But I don't think they're far from the reality. And there's an interview, if you can get hold of a copy of this, it was actually published in Esquire, written by a very young journalist. And it's very evident that Tony Blair just sort of basically was treating this journalist almost with contempt. But his mouth ran away with him, and it's really quite enlightening. Because in the course of the interview, he described Iraq as just a lot of hassle. Torture, he said, it's just not an issue out there. Basically saying that the public don't care about the torture issue. And the Tories, if they win, I won't be attacking them. And that's because he's cut a deal with David Cameron. David Cameron won't oppose his standing for the president of the EU, and Blair will stay out of national politics in this country. If you get it, this article was reprinted actually in the Daily Mail, believe it or not, of all places. The Daily Mail has actually produced some very, very interesting articles in recent months and years. Do take a look at that. Not least, I had Norman Baker earlier, and I'm pleased to say that Dr. David Halpin and his wife Sue here I class amongst my good friends. David is also an avid campaigner for the Palestinian people. He was actually on board the Dignity in December with Cynthia McKinney when it was rammed in international waters. And of course, full credit to Norman Baker. I mean, the standing ovation was extremely well deserved. I mean, not just that, but I think we also ought to acknowledge that Norman Baker has been campaigning for quite some time for transparency of MPs' expenses. And he was vilified in Parliament, because of that campaign alone. Although when I inspected his expenses, I did notice he claimed for 2 bikes. Pedal bikes. But this was the headline. Now, this headline a couple of years ago would have been unthinkable. Did MI5 kill Dr. Kelly? And this article was written by Sue Reed, the Daily Mail. And actually, she's written some very interesting articles, because she wrote another article in the aftermath of the recent Conspiracy Files program on the 7/7 bombings. And she's asked some very, very pertinent questions, and the same here. And although these articles on the surface appear to be a veneer and supporting the official version of events, to anybody who has retained some critical thinking, they ask some very, very pertinent questions. And this is actually very healthy to see, that although it's not overt, because if they were asking them overtly, then the paper would be shut down. So this is, I think, a very interesting turn of events within the media. I think this is the guy that has far more to answer for than the media actually dare to accuse him of. I mean, has anybody here seen if you haven't, I encourage you to see the series that was written, The Thick of It. Sorry, it was The Thick of It. And Martin Sixsmith, of course, who was used to work alongside Alistair Campbell, was one of the consultants on that program, or the film In the Loop. These are fantastic comedies, written as comedies. They're spoofs of this guy and the way he used to rule the roost when he was Tony Blair's right-hand henchman. And we see some other articles in the media that are also spelling out, almost in words of one syllable, what's actually occurring these days. And this is actually a cartoon, Blair, obviously the puppeteer of Brown, but it's actually from The Sun. And in this article, and I've spoken before about Trevor Kavanagh, because Trevor Kavanagh is, without any question, the most influential political writer in this country, on the basis that he writes in The Sun, which is allegedly read by, I use the term read very loosely, of course, but it's allegedly read by about 13 million people. But in this article, I don't have time, unfortunately, to read it all out to you, but if you can find it on the line, I would encourage you to take a look. Gord can't lift a finger without the say-so from Tony. And this spells out exactly what European Union nightmare Britain is walking into. Now, Kavanagh and his boss are undoubtedly globalists, and they are pro-EU, big time. And I believe this article was written just to see what kind of reaction it might get. And the payoff line, because he spelt everything out, and the payoff line, he says, and there ain't a damn thing we can do about it. Of course, what he really wanted to write was, and there ain't a damn thing you can do about it. But he wrote it as, we can do about it. And unfortunately, this kind of media report does highlight the magnitude of the apathy that exists amongst the general populace. It's not just apathy in some cases, it's apathy and willful ignorance. And current global, regional, and national agendas are all being built on the basis of apathy and willful ignorance. I mean, this is just incredible. This is unbelievable. I mean, I was speaking to somebody who used to live in the old Soviet Union, the Russians, that would explain it. And they were saying to me, in Russia, we knew that what was published in the media was a complete crock of lies. We knew that what was on TV was just blatant propaganda. So nobody took any notice at all. In this country, people still think they're actually being told the truth. And that is far more pernicious than the overt totalitarian state that obviously was the Soviet Union. Gordon Brown, of course, has signed us into this. Tony Blair was never going to sully his hands by signing us into the European Union and signing the Treaty of Lisbon. And I'm going to show you in a second, because very, very few people have any real understanding of what the Treaty of Lisbon means and what is going to descend upon us when the Irish probably give the answer that they're expected to give later this year. And of course, in this country, just as in the EU, we will have an unelected president, because this guy has indeed been promised it, and I've been talking about that now for some 2 years. But of course, in the UK, we also have an unelected prime minister. Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, apathy towards this. Mandelson is absolutely calling the shots. And I saw this, by the way. This was on the same page, and I thought, wow, that's a bit strong. But unfortunately, then I realized actually it was a separate article. But Leo McKinstry has written some very interesting articles recently, and I mean, this one I think is extremely pertinent. Why getting out of Europe is the only way to save Britain. Now, that is actually a truism. There's a truism you'll see in a second. And, for those people who actually understand what the Treaty of Lisbon contains, they understand the magnitude of the issue. And I'm going to show you that very few people in public life actually read the Treaty of Lisbon. At the Alternative View, I showed a clip from a YouTube video where both the Miliband's had been approached by the group in London called We Are Change. And it was very evident from the confrontation that neither of the Miliband's had read the Treaty of Lisbon. And this is the document that effectively gives away not just British sovereignty, but the sovereignty of every single nation in Europe. Now, Mandy's empire, if ever you had any doubt about him being de facto the prime minister of the country, this is a list of all the policy committees that Mandelson has a seat on. Now, of course, he doesn't sit on them all himself, but he will appoint his underlings to sit on those committees. So, I mean, this is evidence. I mean, it's prima facie evidence of the influence that this guy has on policy in the UK, and he is totally pro-EU. I mean, the primary objective of putting him back into British politics was to take Britain into the euro. And I would encourage you to take a look at the website wethepeople.ie. It's an Irish website. It's a group of people. It's an increasingly sizable group of people that are coming together to fight for a no vote in the second referendum that the Irish people are being forced to take because they came up with the wrong answer last year. And by the way, if they get the wrong answer this time round, they'll have to take it again next year. But the bribery was put on them immediately they came up with the no vote last year, because all of the infrastructure funding that came from the EU was withdrawn. I mean, this is the magnitude of the bribery that's being put on the people there. But do take a look at this, because there's some excellent, concise information on the EU and how the EU works. And, I mean, if anybody believes that the EU is a democracy, I promise you, you'd only have to spend about 30 minutes on this website to correct that illusion. So get used to this. At the Alternative View 3, coming up in November, we have a guy who, in my opinion, is the world's leading follower, if you like, of the microchip agenda. There's a guy called Greg Nicoletis. And the microchipping agenda is far closer than most of us would actually care to admit. A big part of what's going on in terms of, obviously, chip and pin is a big way to do that. Now, here's an example of a man in public office who has absolutely no clue about what going into the EU really entails. Because he says, stop giving us all these new laws, says the Chief of Justice. Now, the reality is that the new laws aren't being brought into effect by British administrators. These are EU laws that are regulation and have to become legislation in all 27 member states. Now, this is when we start to realize, what's about to hit. Because the MP's expenses issue was a scam. I mean, I'm not saying that the MP's expenses issue isn't a real issue. The timing of it was deliberate to hide all the discussion about the imminent EU elections that were coming up on the 4th of June. So this scam ran for 6 weeks nearly, keeping all debate about the EU out of the media. And yet these were probably the most important European elections ever, because they are the last elections, potentially, before the Treaty of Lisbon is ratified and de facto becomes law across the EU. And the government and the Tories did not want this debate out in the open. They basically wanted to maintain the status quo. They didn't want to run the risk of UKIP getting a massive swing. And then when the Tories get into power next year, who are pro-European, having to contend with a UKIP or UKIP BNP or whatever, majority in Brussels. But when this guy talks about laws coming into the UK, the European Union have passed 111,000 laws since 1957. 20,000 of those have actually found their way onto the statute books in this country. Which means that when the Treaty of Lisbon is signed, 90,000 EU laws will be applied to the UK and right across the rest of Europe instantaneously. But more importantly, they are Napoleonic laws. Europe operates under Napoleonic law. So Britain, which has prided itself on common law for the last 800 or so years, will lose all aspects of common law. Now, what's the difference, you say? Well, the difference is very, very significant. Under common law, everything is legal unless it is specifically prohibited by law. Under Napoleonic law, it's completely the opposite. So everything is illegal unless it is specifically approved. And this is how Codex Alimentarius and the like is coming into be, because basically what the big pharmaceutical companies are doing is making sure that the approval process is so protracted and expensive that nobody other than the big boys can actually afford the approval process. So the smaller companies, the smaller manufacturers are literally on the brink of going out of business, and most of them have no clue, because the apathy and the willful ignorance prevails. And of course, let's look at what's happening in terms of why this apathy and why this willful ignorance prevails. I've talked at length about the issue of the pharmaceutical industry getting people hooked on drugs. And I can tell you that the morning, with a U, the morning was no greater than in the pharmaceutical industry when Michael Jackson died. Because the pharmaceutical industry lost a regular income, reportedly, of $30,000 a month. Now, the pharmaceutical industry's goal is actually to get everybody hooked on $30,000 of drugs a month, or as much as they possibly can. And this is, believe it or not, this is an article from The Sun again. You can see what papers I read, can't you? You know, the problem is, I'm one of those people who keeps the media alive by buying pretty much every paper every day, which is really so sad, isn't it? But, you know, here we have why 1.6 million Brits are hooked on prescription pills. And we know that, this is having a marked impact on consciousness. And I've talked about that at length, and particularly on my DVD about Codex Alimentarius. But I just want to, for a lighter moment, show you that the side effects of drugs, which are normally very negative, but occasionally they can be really quite surprising. And this is from a headline in The Independent a little while ago: antidepressant drugs don't work. Official study. They may not make you depressed, they may make you suicidal. Well, one of these drugs had a very interesting side effect, which was reported recently. And here's a young lady by the name of Sarah Carmen. And she was taking some antidepressants, and unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, it triggered a condition known as permanent sexual arousal syndrome. And Sarah is 200 a day lady, apparently, 200 a day orgasms. And apparently, the danger is, of course, that this upsets the balance of nature. And it's rumoured that a lot of the men around where Sarah lives are wearing these badges now. But a light-hearted look at the sexual revolution that's occurring, if you like, before I touch on something I think is very serious. And that is, we start with a pamphlet that has been issued to a number of school children, which encourages them to have an orgasm a day. Pupils are told they have a right to a good sex life. And, this is outrageous. Basically, this pamphlet could be read, and, read by teenagers with raging hormones. And here's a pamphlet saying they have a right to a sex life. It's a fine line, isn't it? From the right to a sex life to, sex attack, sexual abuse. And this is in the UK. This is in the UK. Check this out. But what I'm going to show you next absolutely shocked me to the core. So much so that I did a number of checks on it. I even asked Brian Gerrish to check it out for me, to check out the validity of this document. And we're absolutely certain that this is a genuine document. And this is actually from the People's United Community website. And it's, look at the headline: Germany and the EU to legalize paedophilia. I'm going to give you two quotes from this. The German government publication promotes incestuous paedophilia as healthy sex. Now, this commentator has said that this German state intervention in family life is a new level of auto-destruction. And the next paragraph is absolutely shocking. It says, fathers do not devote enough attention to the clitoris and vagina of their daughters. Their caresses too seldom pertain to these regions. While this is the only way the girls can develop a sense of pride in their sex, reads the booklet regarding 1 to 3-year-olds. The authors rationalize the child touches all parts of their father's body, sometimes arousing him. The father should do the same. This is total insanity. Now, what you need to understand is that the EU is about harmonization of laws. Harmonization. And what they do is they go for the lowest common denominator and then apply the lowest common denominator across the rest. Now, the German government have actually, or the German legal system has actually ruled recently that the German statutory parliament should take precedence over the EU. But this is going to be interesting because they obviously haven't read the Treaty of Lisbon. Because the Treaty of Lisbon basically prevents any of that occurring. And how many of you are aware that the Treaty of Lisbon also effectively makes illegal any a political party that includes any aspect of national sovereignty in its manifesto? Which means the Scottish Nationalists, Plaid Cymru, UKIP will all become illegal because everybody has to buy in to the concept of the European Union. Here's another article about the reading material that's being encouraged to our youth. I was brought up in Enid Blyton. I don't remember too much sex in that, or Swallows and Amazon. I don't think Arthur Ransom knew what it was. This is undermining society. It is undermining the basic substance and thread of everything that our society is built on. We are screwing with the heads of our kids. We even have a professor in Manchester University advocating that Ritalin, which I talked about at some length last year, that Ritalin be made available over the counter because it improves concentration. Ritalin is like cocaine. The pharmacologists don't actually understand how Ritalin works because actually it's a stimulant. But in the brains and the minds of young people, it has the opposite effect. So, really, what legacy are we leaving our children? What legacy are we leaving the next generation? I think I alluded last night, and certainly in some discussions I had afterwards. The people who are driving this agenda have very, very long-term goals. They don't just think 1 or 3 or 5 or 10 years ahead. These guys are working to multi-generational agendas of 100, 200, 500 years. They work on the basis that all they need to do is contribute as much as they possibly can to that agenda, and they will have effectively achieved their life's work. We have to get our mindset into much the same and not worry that what we do today, we can't see the benefit of tomorrow. We have to get into the mindset that the actions that we take today, we may never see the benefit of that in our lifetime. But we will at least have given the next generation a chance to recover from this very, very aggressive agenda, which in my opinion, and I've discussed this over the past 2 or 3 years, is to push humanity back into permanent slavery, financial and economic slavery. This is actually an article from Time magazine. It was actually looking at the issues in Spain, which are no different from elsewhere in Europe. We do have literally a generation that has no direction, has no idea where it's heading. And as somebody alluded to earlier in the conference, they're coming out of university with bullshit degrees that mean, absolutely nothing. And I used this phrase last year, bio-spiritual warfare, and I claim no credit for it. I did actually, come up with this term, but then I thought, hang on a second, I'm sure somebody must have used that term before, and of course I Googled it, and that's when I discovered Leonard Horowitz. And that was why I invited Len to be one of the speakers at the AV2 event earlier this year. These are all the facets that basically are impacting upon us and keeping us in a state of apathy or willful ignorance. Anybody see the recent series of Torchwood? All the children, we are coming, we are coming. What's bollocks? They're here. They're here now. We are making assumptions. It's why I perhaps get a little emotional sometimes when we make assumptions that the people who are driving the global agenda think like we do. They do not. They have demonstrated that. They are sociopaths. They are psychopaths. And I've talked about the bloodline, and it's very different from the bloodline that most people think of in terms of the Da Vinci Code. There is a bloodline here that these guys are trying to protect, and it is not benign towards humanity by any stretch of the imagination. 2 minutes. Okay, thanks. It's good because I'm coming to the end. 2 minutes? Sorry. So Reagan said, really, is not an alien force already amongst us? He used that many times in his presidency, and he said, what could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our people than war and the threat of war? Well, that war is ongoing. Most people think of war in terms of its physical manifestation. But just very quickly, this is a quote from Dr. John Coleman, writing in The Conspirators' Hierarchy, the Committee of 300. And he made reference to the agenda to establish the Aquarian conspiracy, which basically suggests, the hypothesis is that the whole New Age movement is actually a political construct. Let me just read you very quickly. It says, the politics of fear and denial It's a quote from 1984. He had won the victory over himself, says the concluding line of George Orwell's grim novel, 1984. He loved Big Brother just as hostages sometimes become fond of their abductors. We become attached to the factors that imprison us. Our habits, customs, the expectations of others, rules, schedules, the state. Why do we give away our power or never claim it at all? Perhaps so that we can avoid decisions and responsibility. We are seduced by pain avoidance, conflict avoidance. Well, that avoidance is manifesting big time within the New Age community. Here's the logo from the World Health Organization. Some people say, oh, that's the caduceus. No, it's not. Not at all is it the caduceus. It's the staff of life. It's a single serpent over a grid. Which grid were we firing? It's over a grid, over the planet. The colors, by the way, are no accident. Here's the other half of the caduceus. Here we have consumerist materialism, represented on the logo of the World Health Organization. Here we have the logo of those on the purely spiritual path. It is two sides of the same coin. We have to bring those together. The only way we actually are able to pull ourselves out of this is to combine and become whole. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a spiritual journey, a spiritual awakening, a process of metanoia to go through. As Stuart Wilde observed, it's a 1,000-day journey. But once we're through that 1,000-day journey, we've gone from doing to being, and then we have to combine the two. And that journey of the Kundalini, of bringing that balance of the spiritual into the material world, is what enables us to perhaps open up the frequencies within the pineal gland. And that's what gives us our wings. And that's, in my opinion, what is being alluded to with the crop circles this year. It's find our wings. It's accept that responsibility. London, we've talked about this before. It's a very, very important year within the New Age community. In my opinion, it's a very, very important year within those who are today the powers that be. They know they need to establish the New Jerusalem. As I've discussed before in my presentation, Fool Me Once, I believe that they're planning something seriously mega at the London Olympics. The bottom line, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is the portal. It's 11/11 exactly on December 21st, 2012, when we enter into another 5,125-year cycle. George W. Bush said, just 2 months after being sworn in as president, talking at a press dinner, he said, you can fool some of the people all of the time, and those are the ones you concentrate on. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not some people. We need to rise up and actually participate in this game. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Crane. Thank you very much, Ian Crane. Brilliant stuff. Okay. Fantastic stuff. And there are leaflets for AV3, I believe, around. Go and see Ian. Okay.
Oh.